This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern.
And I'm your co-hostess, Dalia Shenlin.
Every week we bring you conversations with authors about the books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. All you have to do is go to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us because we are counting on you.
This week we're going to be discussing a topic we haven't addressed in a very long time. In fact, ever. Nudity. Yes, it is a liberation from politics, populism, the Middle East, the conflict. Well, it does involve sort of politics. To explain all this, we have Sarah Schrank. She is a professor of history at California State University at Long Beach, where she teaches courses in United States urban history, women's history, body studies, and public art. She received her BA from McGill University and her master's and PhD from the University of California at San Diego. She serves on the editorial board of Public Art Dialogue. She's the author of 3 books, and we will be discussing her latest. It's called Free and Natural: Nudity and the American Cult of the Body, published by University of Pennsylvania Press in 2019. You may have also noticed that Sarah did her BA at my alma mater, McGill. And yes, we know each other all that time. That's a long way back, but it's been maybe 25 years in between. Sarah, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, both of you. It's a delight.
Great. Sarah, you track the evolution of nudity in modern American society, specifically as a kind of ideology evolving through history. Can you identify any sort of unifying theme to the various phases of nudist movements from the late 19th century, 1930s, post-war, post-sexual revolution? Is free and natural the unifying theme or anything else?
That's a very good question. And one of the things that surprised me when I started working on this project is how much of a social movement it actually can be considered, right? I sort of, nudity, nudism, I thought of it as a set of kind of cultural activities, but not actually an organized social movement. And the things I think ideologically connected from the 19th century to the present would be the themes of health, challenging the status quo, anti-authoritarianism, and also changing concepts of the family. And that this sort of originates as a kind of wholesome activity for the whole family to participate in. And when nudism runs up against the sexual revolution in the 1970s, and 1960s for that matter, the concept of the family starts to shift. But of course, if you study, the shifting sexual mores of the middle of the 19th century, there were also shifts there too. So I would say that those were the main ideological connections. And as far as a social movement, again, it's about sort of reclaiming the body from capitalism. It's about challenging the industrialism of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And then moving forward, sometimes it's been about spaces. It's about notions of the public, what's private, challenging obscenity law. And later in the book, I discuss this in terms of the 1970s in particular, but environmentalism, civil rights, and feminism, and a little bit later, even gay rights. So there are a lot of tenets of other social movements and ideological groups that overlap with this particular sort of cultural enterprise.
So I want to stay on the issue of ideology and ask you, because nudity and this return to nature, etc., has often been associated with the great ideological movements of the 20th century, be it fascism or communism and even Zionism to an extent.
Nude Zionists?
Not nude, but instead, this reclaiming the body and connecting to the the body, the countryside, the soil, etc. To what extent do you see overlaps with those movements? And the interesting thing about the movement that you describe is that it's in some ways it's reactionary and in some ways it's progressive. How does it play out?
It's a very good and complicated question, so I'll try to give a nutshell answer, and we can develop it as we move along. The idea of the body as a healthful vessel for the individual gets expanded into the idea of the body as representing literally the body politic, right? So the body is a stand-in for the representation of a nation state, a representation for a larger social group. And so you do see that, of course, with the Nazis. You see this with fascism, the rise of fascism in the late 20s and 1930s, and the claiming of the Übermensch and, the horrors that would unfold in the Second World War. And Germany had a long history of Lebensreform or life reform, these movements that were very much tied to nature, tied to health, and had a robust nudist culture really certainly before the United States. And in fact, that's where we inherited from. But by the time you get to the rise of Hitler, the nudists were primarily associated with communism and socialism. And so even though there were elements of it that had this Übermensch thing, and there were fascists who also were nudists, they were kind of mixed in ideologically with communists and socialists. And so during these purges and murders of the 1930s, Hitler just wiped all the nudists out because it was easier just to clean the whole thing out than to try to nitpick with who was actually on his side and who was everybody else. And this produced very interesting and, of course, very devastating conversations in the United States, because nudism, of course, had already started here by the late 1920s. So when the uprising of fascism happens, you have these weird conversations in the nudist magazines, which were the main organ for disseminating these ideologies throughout the United States, as to where we're supposed to stand on Hitler, where we're supposed to stand on fascism. And most people were like, they're killing us there. So literally, because our movement represents a liberation that Nazi ideology cannot, sustain. So it has a very kind of violent encounter in the 1930s. And the form it takes in the United States is nudists were often socialist, often had connections to the Communist Party, but often kept those politics very sublimated. And not just because the United States had such profound anti-communist sentiments itself, but because there was this really horrifying, violent history that was happening, that had happened and was continuing to happen through the Second World War. So that's a real bummer part of this part of the story. And one that I do talk about early in the book.
What about the American version? I mean, you went through the German history, which is interesting, and there's also overlap, between German racial theories and the American roots of that, which we've explored on this show with James Whitman's book. What form did the American version of nudism take, in those early years? What did it grow out of, and how did it express the two political directions, if at all? Maybe you're saying it really mostly was affiliated with the more, like you said, socialism and workers' unions, et cetera.
Well, it's both. And this gets back to the original question, whether it's progressive or reactionary, or somewhere in between. I mean, you have the idea that freeing the body of clothing, of jewelry, and the markers of class, the markers of gender, and even some of the markers of race and ethnicity will lead to a more unified, uniform, and equitable society. And so that's where it kind of ties in with labor movements and socialism. But another key piece of nudism was tied to eugenics. And certainly in the earlier part of the book, there's discussions about racial purity, and of course, this is about white racial purity. There's that if we, breed better babies, and have them exposed to the sun, they grow up this way, then they'll be stronger, better Americans. And it's very much integrated with that old capital P progressive type of eugenics that, haunts the history of American medicine, of American liberal politics, liberalism, shall we say, starting the late 19th to early 20th century. So I don't know if that's answering your question, but those are two pieces of it, right?
Yeah. And I want to also find out, what is the uniquely American kind of understanding of the naked body? I mean, you don't get into this as much in the book, but surely you've done a lot of thinking about it. The Puritan ethic and the puritanical and conservative sexuality of American society. Is American nudism a particular form of reaction against American prudishness?
Yes. That would be the short answer. The Puritan legacy haunts this. One of the things that's interesting about early nudism in the United States was actually how Christian many of its members were, that they were, almost Christian evangelicals, but who felt that the idea that the body was impure was troubling misinterpretation of the Bible and a misinterpretation of the New Testament, and even in a misinterpretation of the origin story, going back to the Old Testament. And so that was definitely a radical reaction to sort of the prudery of the United States. Part of it too, though, nudists took a lot of flack for taking on a foreign practice. The idea that it had these German origins, the fact that it was connected to just older stuff in the world. India had long histories through the Jains of practiced religious nudism. And so Americans who practiced this in the early phase in the 1930s were sort of seen as, splitting off from sort of a contained, waspy American lifestyle. And even though many of them were very conservative, right, and had connections to some ideological frameworks that we'd find quite tainted, like eugenics, they were still seen as radicals at the time.
Yeah, I wonder about the pioneers, the first ideologues of the movement, about the personalities themselves. And in particular, I wonder how eccentric they were. I can imagine them both as like these weird gurus on the one hand, but also as stern ideologues on a quest to reform society. What were they? Maybe both or in between?
And one started as a minister, correct? A British minister who...
Yes. Yeah. Yes. It's a big question. George Wharton James, who I opened the book with, was a immigrant from England who was connections to Methodism, who was actually got himself into some trouble, sort of sex scandal in the late 19th century, and was run out of California, and then comes back to California, becomes a journalist, and actually spends his life making quite a good living studying American Indians and getting very interested in the California Indians, the Indians of the American Southwest, and writing about it. And people were eating this stuff up in the early 20th century. There's a big interest in this, particularly from Anglo-Americans, sort of in the culture that they had just eradicated by moving westward, right? Once you've rendered a population unthreatening, suddenly they become culturally really interesting and collectible. So George Wharton James is part of this. But he was also this interesting character in that his interests intersect with New Thought and Theosophism and new modernist interest in the primitive. And so his aesthetic interests, his intellectual interests, experiential sexuality, were just very much part of this kind of modernist impulse towards something new. So he was less a guru of nudism than of all these sort of experimental strands. And he was, a bit of a dilettante and who wove them together. And it came out largely in his fascination with the California Indians, who would often talk about how interesting it is that they would be naked. But in fact, actually, they weren't naked. They just were, somewhat less clothed than he would have been back in England. So that's one example. A better example of a sort of nudist ideologue is Morris Parmley, who was actually the founder of criminology in the United States. He's an academic. He had strong connections to the American left. He had some very disturbing views on race and gender. He was really quite, seemed to be very, he's simultaneously a kind of racial purist, but he also understood that one of the reasons why people held on to the racist ideas they did in the 1930s is because you didn't see other people. So part of it's, so racism is a subjective product of the fact that people live in their alienated, isolated environments. And so his idea is that if you lived through a process of gymnosophy, which was his kind of name for this mixing of health activities, exercise, and nakedness, and you included everybody, black and white, otherwise, it would start to eradicate those differences. But in articulating this, it was this kind of, I find, awkward, clumsy 30s language where he would, sort of make judgments about people of different ethnic and racial groups that we would not certainly say in the 21st century. And his attitudes towards women are deeply troubling. He found female bodies that didn't fall in line with what he considered attractive to be acceptable. And so, so when and I talk about Morris Parmalee, but he basically was very important in writing about nudism and articulating it as a type of organized ideology, organized social movement, and a political position.
Now, since you raised sex, I think we need to talk about sex. I mean, it's hard to have a book about nudity without thinking about it.
Let's talk about sex, baby.
Let's talk about sex. And I think that one of the things I found fascinating, which it never occurred to me before, was your observation that nudist movements at points sought to de-shame sexuality, take the shame away from the human body. And you quote a 1930s magazine article saying that the nudist movement, quote, does not conceive of the human body as being in any way shameful in itself, but accords to every part of the body an equally normal naturalness. In this view, an elbow, a pubic arch, or a nose are equally respectable. What I want to know is, does that also kind of flatten or even negate sexuality by sort of equating every body part together? Does that in some way diminish the higher, wonderful meaning of sexuality rather than just neutralizing the negative aspect?
It's a really good question. And this was a conflict for the nudist movement out of the gate and remains one to this day, I believe. I mean, the modern nudism and the period we're talking about are almost 100 years apart, and really did participants think about it differently. And public sort of understandings of sex and sexuality are also a little bit different, although I'm not sure anything has changed all that much. It's really an issue of context. And that quotation that you've just read was a part of a larger point I was making about what they were making, which is that the body it's about context. So if you see the body in a work of art, it's not shameful. If you see the body represented in dance or something, not shameful. If the body is naked but with its own family, then it's not shameful. And it's not even sexual. I mean, that's part of what that piece is about, is trying to kind of de-sex sort of the nude body, unless there's a sort of a sexual encounter. And so, yes, I think to answer your question, it does sort of take away from the fact that sexuality isn't necessarily just, intercourse. It can be sensuality. It can be this other sort of type of human experience, the zhuzh you get when you sort of meet someone who you have that good energy with, whether or not it ever manifests in anything. And for nudists, they really wanted to they understood sexual power and sexual energy as being very difficult to control, right? That's sort of part of how so many societies organize themselves around containing women, trying to control gender, because it's about sex and sexuality becoming elusive and hard to contain. So nudists try to really tie everything back to the physical body. So much like the body breathes, yes, it has sex, but that's just one other function of the body. It's not what the nudity is about. So they were trying to really separate the nakedness from the sexuality, which is kind of an interesting strategy, right? Because on the one hand, for people who are not nudists, nudity often signifies a sexual situation, certainly if you're around other people. And nudists were trying to say, no, you could be naked. And if you weren't so weird and uptight about sex in the first place, you wouldn't even be finding this an exciting or arousing set of circumstances. But it's a pretty thin line, and it really has to do with like who you're talking about and where you are and sort of what the expectations are.
I'd like to go back to what we touched upon briefly before, and that is about the origins of the movement in Germany and Britain, and the nudist philosophy, and it's the migration of these ideas to the United States and their adaptation to the particular political and cultural context in America, however many years later. Can you take us through some of these ideas, and maybe those more interesting, those who left behind and didn't make it to America?
Lebensreform was a cultural movement in mid-19th century Germany, basically a middle-class movement reacting to the rise of industrialism. And so it was an idea that if people were going to be safe from toxins, safe from overwork, safe from, coal mines pumping out, dirt into the air, people needed to get back to a state of nature. And so this is the origin, to a great extent, of outdoor exercise, purposive exercise, and hiking, And yes, nudism, also vegetarianism, and new prohibitions against alcohol and tobacco, and sort of a purification of the body. So you can sort of see how this would end up getting connected to notions of the Übermensch, 50 or 60 years later. But it was already developing by the late 19th century, certainly. And in the early 20th century, and even before, you have a lot of Germans moving to the United States. So the big migrations of Germans in the 1850s, and they come as far west as California. Anaheim, where Disneyland was founded by Germans. And this is in the 1850s, 1860s, and they brought some of these Lebensreform ideas with them. And so part of it manifested in organic farming very early, like ideas around, trying to grow your own food, even though the beginnings of large-scale agribusiness was already a thing, not eating processed food. So sort of the things that we think of as hippie stuff or the health food store, right? And something so specific to California had been brought in from the 19th century from Germany. That was already happening. And then the other thing that happens in California that's worth thinking about is that in the 1850s and 60s, you also have a large Chinese population. And guess what the Chinese bring with them? Apothecary, acupuncture, alternative medicine, which to them is an alternative, but it's alternative to the West. And American doctors, including the American Medical Association, were very, very intrigued. They were racist and treated the Chinese horribly, but they were fascinated by Chinese medical practice. So California becomes this place that's already this alternative body space, largely because of what these incoming migrants were bringing with them and ended up staying. And so when you get the nudist stuff coming to initially not California, but New York, that's where it starts. What the form it takes here in the United States is an urban practice. And so these nudists in 1929, 1930 in New York City wanted to bring that Lebensreform stuff, the getting back to nature, and then weave it into the fabric of the American city. They thought, because people aren't going to go live in the country anymore, like people are moving into the cities. Let's make this an urban experience. We can do it on our rooftops. We can do it on our, porches, on our 14th story, New York, Brooklyn apartment buildings. But of course, they kept getting arrested doing that. That was not going to be accepted. Even when they tried to rent the YMCA and have a little nudist thing there, neighbors called it in, the cops dragged them off. So that's when you start in the United States getting this movement into the country to practice nudity because they couldn't do it in the city. And in the countryside, they could buy their own land. And so that's when you talk about ideological changes in the United States, a lot of this has to do with private home ownership, private land ownership, notions about the powers that come with owning your own land, and capitalism, right? So once you are in control of your own property, then it becomes these fights over property rights as opposed to necessarily the morality of what you're doing. But you had to be on your own land to do it. And then what happens, of course, is that you get nudist colonies set up in upstate New York, but you start to get a big movement westward, certainly by the 30s and 40s. People start moving west. And then they end up in California, where there already is this alternative body culture that goes back 60 years.
Right.
And that was one of these things that was weird about this book, is that the tendrils of the stuff connecting up was very surprising to me.
Can you distinguish a little bit between the different phases when what you just mentioned now, when nudism was something to be practiced outdoors in public ways, but also when it becomes a matter of in the home, family nudism, and because I think that's an interesting distinction. I'd love you to explore what they stood for, but also how it ended up overlapping with architectural movements. I mean, that again seemed obvious when you talked about it, but it was not something I would have anticipated. So I'd love for you to expand on that.
Sure. So if the origins in the U.S. of of social nudism was to be in cities, and that didn't work so well. So people moved out to the countryside. And that's still true. I mean, the idea that nudism is tied to these retreats, to retreat culture, getting back to nature, going camping. I mean, it still has similar attributes to this very day. But starting in the late 1930s, but moving really during the Second World War era, the emphasis was on moving nudism indoors. And part of the problem was that there was a sense that the nudists, many of whom had connections to socialism and communism, were coming under more scrutiny because of the war. And it's wartime. It's conservatism sort of ends up trying to contain the population. Like you want everyone on board to for the good fight. You don't need to have all these subgroups off doing things. So there's a push to move people sort of indoors. And this push isn't really coming externally. It's coming from within the culture, because nudists are always constantly fighting legal battles that are very expensive. They're stressful. I have examples of people who end up in jail for months or years. There's real costs to this. And there's a feeling that they're under more scrutiny and surveillance. And so it's better to move it inside and make it private. And also, nudists had been doing better fighting fights that involve private property. So you start to see the nudist magazines in the late 30s and 40s, the beginnings of something they call domestic nudism, which is, so instead of having this outdoor sunshine and wellness thing, you suddenly just live your whole life inside. And to make it work, you had to design your inner spaces in ways that you could live this life and then not be seen from the outside. And this really manifests in the 1950s during the McCarthy era and the growth of American suburbs. And so as these prefab suburbs are spreading across the country, very much so in the American South Belt that runs, or the Sun Belt that runs from Florida to California, you begin to see people who really don't have much money, working class and lower middle class people, getting plans to do it yourself nudist homes. And they design their houses with windows set in certain ways that if you look in, you can't see through the whole house. You have foyers set on angles. You sort of place things in various ways. So your house doesn't look like a bunker. But you also, everyone in the house doesn't have to get dressed every time the doorbell would ring. And the origins of, shall we say, nudist architecture really go back to the 1920s with the high-end architectural commissions by people like Richard Neutra. Very famously did the Lovell Health House in 1929 in Los Angeles, which was a house purposely built to allow in as much sun as possible, because by the 1920s, there was this belief that vitamin D was the most essential nutrient we could get. So
which is so faddish, because now it's back. It's back in. Everybody's talking about vitamin D and sunbaths.
Vitamin D again. And there are interesting connections, I think, to actually our pandemic moment. Everyone was shut in for a year. And so everyone's like, oh, we're have a depletion of vitamin D in our system. The American Medical Association, by the way, did know in the 1920s that too much sun exposure caused skin cancer. They'd known that since the First World War, but they made a concerted decision to promote sun exposure because they figured the vitamin D benefits outweighed the skin cancer threat. So, but they knew it, and they had known it since about 1916. Anyway, so Richard Neutra was commissioned to build the Lovell Health House, and it was a house that allowed for nudist living unseen by neighbors. And then this trickles down to lower middle class people in the suburbs of the 1950s.
What happens after the sexual revolution?
Well, there's a great line in the book where a nudist retreat owner says, the sexual revolution killed nudism.
I was just going to say, when sexuality is everywhere and porn is everywhere and you can't avoid sex if you tried, maybe even though this is not necessarily a revolutionary movement, maybe there's just not that much need for it. What do you think?
Oh, well, there's a big difference between the sexual revolution and the sexuality of the 21st century. Whew, very big difference. And the reactions of people vis-a-vis organized nudism is very different. So with the sexual revolution, yes, there was suddenly this problem where nudism, organized, seemed really too wholesome and too uptight because it had all these rules and it was about the family, and he was always in a lot of nudist retreats and nudist colonies didn't have alcohol or drugs, and it was a very, very clean way of living. And participants in the sexual revolution wanted to get loose and let it all hang out and do what you want to do and be who you want to be. And so they kind of ran afoul of each other. there were some very serious nudist people who tried to sort of walk a line between the two cultures. And for part of the 1960s, it sort of worked. But ultimately, you end up with a split between sort of younger sexual revolution people who get more involved in other political activities like environmentalism and gay rights and freeing the beaches for nudist recreation. And the old guard nudists who had fought all of these obscenity battles, they just kind of go inside. Like they retreat to their private resorts and private, because it's just the two can't really meet. In the present day, yeah, you're right. And this is one of the reasons why I was inspired to write the book. We have access to more nudity and online pornography than at any time, and more just images of human beings than at any time in human history. I mean, the number of images we just see over the course of a day, flipping through our phone, whether they're nude or not, often sexualized, often subliminal, whether they're intentionally or not, then at any point. So what relevance could nudism possibly have? Like, which now seems like some sort of joke from the 1960s, right? Some relic, of the Aquarian age, something like what someone's weird uncle does, like that. It's like a punchline. And what's fascinating to me is that as much as old guard nudists have been worrying about nudism dying off, and I talk a lot about a lot of the reasons for that fear in the book. That's probably too long for me to get into right now. One of the real fears is that there's just so much of this available. But millennials, and increasingly the generation following the millennials, they understand that type of sexuality and those images commodify them. That like they're commodified by Instagram, they're commodified by Facebook, they're commodified by everything. And so when I teach this stuff or talk to them in other venues, the fascination that they show with a culture that was about the body purely and was trying to not be sexualized is utterly just seductive. And in fact, numbers of like nudist practitioners are going up. Again, like people are becoming interested in this idea that you can be naked and it doesn't have to be sexualized, and it's you making that decision and it's not for sale. Now, I also make the point in the nudist lifestyle consumerism chapter at the end of the book that there's confusion too, because sometimes those young people also then take the images of themselves at a nudist colony and then, market them, right? Because it's hard to not see the connection to commodification. But their sense of being self-commodified and being commodified is so strong, and they react they're so upset and angered by it, and they feel so manipulated by the larger society and by capitalism that they want to try to do something else. And that's where they find this culture interesting. And you see it in nudist activities, where you'll have the old guard. I keep calling the old guard, but people quite a bit older than I am. And then you get this younger wave, and they're so cute.
Maybe they'll all end up in a Walden Pond naked.
But it's still, it seems like still a niche activity or a niche movement compared to other, say, formerly transgressive or perhaps an aberration like homosexuality and perhaps women liberation, etc. Why didn't it undergo a similar mainstreaming that we see with LGBT or other now progressive movements?
I think it's because at the end of the day, nudity still shocks. Like it's still shocking in a way that, one of the things, we just had Pride here, and you guys may be having Pride there. I'm not sure.
Later this week.
Right. So one of the big conversations in the media and within the gay community and also straight community is like how commodified Pride's become, right? So all these big corporations are like sort of selling gayness back to gay people, but also to straight people. And the social movement and the violence and the like bloodletting to allow for gay rights to happen. Sorry, I'm tapping on the table again. To allow that to happen suddenly just disappears into this sort of veneer of kumbaya and everyone's getting along, and the fight and the history is lost. And, women's rights can also tell a similar story, although the commodification has been different. With nudism, it's hard to commodify. It's hard to sell nudists things. right? You can't sell them clothes. You can't.
Well, that was part of the founding ideology, right? To get away from all the urbanization and the commercialization of everything, even in the early 20th century.
The materialism. And so really there's not a lot you can sell them. So in that sense, it can't take the same commodification route. I mean, there are resorts that are expensive, and there's nudist cruising, and you can spend a lot of money as a kind of tourist nudist if you feel like it. That's certainly true, but that's not a social movement. That's not political. I think ultimately, I talk about this too. Nudity. The whole point of nudism was to try to make the body a non-shocking thing, and they never could do it. They could do it within their own culture, but they could never do it outside of it. And that speaks to a lot of ambivalence, I think, about what a human being is. I think we are very uncomfortable around nudity. So that makes it hard to tie to a stable social movement for the long haul, even though the culture is doing very well. There are a couple 100,000 card-carrying nudists in the United States right now who belong to the American Association of Nude Recreation, and then all sorts of subgroups and other clubs. So it's happening. I think of it as a social movement. I'm not sure all nudists think of themselves as part of a social movement, but many do. But I don't think it'll ever be mainstreamed.
All right. Professor Sarah Schrank, Professor of History at California State University at Long Beach, and the author of the newly published Free and Natural Nudity and the American Cult of the Body. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. This was fun.
By the way, something that our listeners don't know is that this interview was carried out in the nude. And also big thanks to Itai Shalem, our station manager, and Ariel Cohen, our producer. And now we've got a request, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please write us a review. Bad or good, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing to our Patreon campaign. Please check out our archive. It has well over 600 interviews to keep you entertained, interested, and hopefully annoyed. And you can like us on Facebook and follow me and Dalia, as well as the Tel Aviv Review podcast on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from Dalia and from me, goodbye.